I've got a dodgy clicker, so I'll just warn you in advance. Sir Francis Galton was a British polymath studying what today we would call the STEM subjects. And he made a large contribution to those subjects. And we might not have heard of Sir Francis Galton, but we probably have heard a number of phrases that he coined. So, for instance, the phrase eugenics, nature versus nurture, and of course, standard deviation and standard distribution. These are all phrases that we know, but they're phrases that Sir Francis, in his work studying at the turn of last century, he coined those phrases. So he was a clever chap. In fact, he shared the same grandparents as Charles Darwin. And it's the work that he did in statistics that I'd like to share with you today and then bring that back to the subject matter. And in 1907, he attended a country fair in Plymouth in the south of England. And in that country fair, they had a competition. And that competition was to guess the weight of a dressed oxen. So basically, they would parade a large ox. You would pay sixpence. You would write your name on a card, and you would write the guess. And just over 800 people that day paid their sixpence and put in a guess. Now, Sir Francis Galton, of course, being a statistician, was interested not so much in the weight of the cow, but in the data set. And up to that point, he'd done some very interesting work in sorting seeds into their respective sides. And he had noticed something, that when you get to the average size of a seed, there's quite a lot in any given sample. And then as you move out to the edges, there's less and less. And he had coined the phrase a standard distribution. So when he got hold of this data set, which he borrowed, he was fascinated to analyse it to see if he could find anything. And this is the actual article that he published in Nature magazine in 1907. And what you're looking at here is, if you look at the bottom left, that represents the lowest guess of the weight. And if you look at the right-hand side, that represents the heaviest guess of the weight. And he sorted and plotted those, and you can see that that represents a standard distribution. Well, what did that tell Sir Francis? What did it tell about the population? And the thing to know about the people that had entered that competition, there would have been experts, such as butchers, or people that work with cattle every day, and there would have been the average everyday punter who had an opinion and thought he might be able to guess the weight. And when he analysed that set, he said if we took any one guess at random, we would be, the probable error was 45 pounds off, or 3.1%. So regardless of whether you were an expert or an average punter, you would get 3.1% either side of the guess, which I don't think actually is that bad. But that's not what he was interested in. He had done some previous work, and in this previous work, he was looking at voting and came up with the notion that one vote should have, in a democratic vote, one value, and that is no one vote was any more value than any other. So on this principle, he reckoned that what today we call the mean, he reckoned that that very central point would represent what he would call the vox populi, or the voice of the people, because if it was any greater, then there would be a majority that thought the cow weighed less, and if it was any less, there'd be a majority vice versa. So he was very interested, for this data set, on what was the vox populi. And when he did that analysis, it was only £9 off. It was more accurate. It was, in fact, less than 1% off of the actual weight of the oxen. So just absorb that for a second. What he discovered is that in that population of experts and laymen aside, there was something, some tacit knowledge, some wisdom that existed in that crowd that you couldn't pull out of one particular individual. And he wrote about this and published it back in 1907. And this is another excerpt, what he actually said was the average competitor that might put in a guess would probably be just as qualified to make a policy decision as they would to guess the weight of the ox, because we had experts, as we do in business and government, and we had lay people. So what does that mean? So he realised that there's a tacit wisdom within crowds, and he had no way of capturing that. There were 800 entries to that competition, and it probably took him several days to plot this and sort them by hand. There was no spreadsheets, there were no computers, and it would have been an effort. So that small article that was published in 1907, although it had what's quite an outstanding discovery, we couldn't do anything about it. But that's not the case, of course, today. And so if we think about this, if we think about the wisdom that's inherent in crowds, and if I was to channel Sir Francis today and bring him forward, I think he'd be really excited about today. He'd be very excited because what the Premier's just told us about is how do we capture the wisdom that sits within crowds to help shape our policy. And if I showed him the Your Say website, and if you look there, there's almost 35,000 registered contributors. South Australian population willing to have an opinion about important policies that affect our everyday lives. And I think Sir Francis Galton would have thought that that's pretty cool. And when I showed him the Fund My Community experiment, where in theory you could log in and you were given $1 million and said if you could apply this $1 million to community funding applications, how would you spend it? And when you get lots of people, and it was more than 800, that say this is how I would spend it, then that gives you an insight into your population. And again, this was an experiment, and I believe it was a very successful experiment. And finally, the citizen juries. This is the vox populi that he was talking about. And I think that he would be incredibly impressed that a government, I'd be amazed at the technology that's available that allows some of these things to happen, but I think he would be amazed at a government that 108 years later could take a discovery that he found and put it to good use. And so we've talked about the past, and we've sort of brought that into the common era, but what about the future? Well, Sir Francis Galton, no doubt, was much more intelligent than I, and I doubt he could have seen what today would have looked like. So I'm not going to pretend for one moment that I might be able to see the future. But there is one thing that I know, and that is when governments work with business leaders such as myself, and they work with communities and universities, I know that we will be better together. Thank you.